They said she was made of fire, and she said, "I am quick to anger. But it is because all of the colors inside of me turn to rage when they are silenced." They said emotional dysregulation. And she said, "My mood is a temperamental ocean, enormous and pulled in infinite directions." They said marked impulsivity, an inability to regulate responses to stimuli. And she said, when everything is an emergency, it is impossible to prepare for disaster. They said frequent suicide gestures. Gesture, as in the physicality of speech. Just as the poem demonstrates that which has no words, so do the injuries illustrate that which is unimaginable. They said a pattern of violent relationships, and she said, "My ocean loves just as deep as it hates. My ocean buries its history and vomits it up on the shore. The sea glass soft as my apologies." They said difficult to treat. She said, "How do you disentangle the roots from a tree? How do you uncurl a bonsai from its contortions even when it knows it will not live long this way? How do you learn to stop hurting yourself when it is the closest you've come to being quiet?" They call me borderline like an insult, but I know how it feels to be limitless. Women who feel in extremes are taught to be quiet about our grief, are taught control, contortion. A bonsai bent into impossible positions, the contortionist curls herself into a glass box. Look how small she can become. Watch how her bones turn to cartilage, and when she disappears entirely, all around the doctors gasp, as if they did not intend to make her this way. They call me borderline because I am the border between extremes. My highs are helium, my lows a skydive. The border lines that climb my skin speak of nights I did not know how to feel this much, this inhibition of my own grief. I curl myself into a glass box, but I do not fit. My ocean salt spills out around me. In 1993, Marsha Linehan develops dialectical behavior therapy as the radical acceptance of two extreme opposites. I am learning to be at once the storm and the lake, the sea glass and the broken bottle. I am learning how to feel without forcing myself to drown. So the poem I just read for you explores the symptoms of borderline personality disorder from a first-person perspective. It's rare that any mental illness is discussed from lived experience, but personality disorders carry a unique stigma. Stigma, a mark of disgrace or shame resulting from stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. For me, stigma was my teachers asking if I wanted to be treated differently when I disclosed my self-harm. It was my mother begging dozens of doctors for help, all of whom replied with not to worry. I was simply being a typical moody teenage girl. It was silence, constant and threatening. A unique feature of the stigma associated with borderline personality disorder is that it is usually perpetuated by the people we turn to in our time of need. I want to tell you a story to illustrate how this clinician-led stigma impacted me. It was during one of my worst suicidal episodes when I took myself to the emergency room of the psychiatric hospital. I waited by myself for an hour before a nurse came to take my blood pressure. I waited for another 2 hours before a different nurse came to talk to me. She told me it would be another couple of hours before I was seen because they needed to triage. You see, even though a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder is an empirical predictor of suicide attempts, we are often taken less seriously in crisis due to the frequency of our ideation. I was angry, so I stood up and I left the hospital. No one tried to stop me. I walked slowly, hoping someone would follow me. My phone rang. I sent it to voicemail. A nurse told me I could call back and make an appointment for the next week. It is an acutely strange experience to be trained in suicide risk assessment and to experience a suicidal episode. It is an acutely invalidating experience to be able to assess your own risk better than those you turn to in your time of need. In that moment, I felt so completely alone. Suicidal episodes are very acute beings. Ideation, especially for those of us with suicidal histories, escalates to its maximum within hours. For this reason, timing is crucial to suicide prevention. Postponing crisis intervention by any number of days is essentially telling the suicidal patient, "We do not believe you." I will never know if my experience was in fact due to my diagnosis. My disorder often materializes in the form of identity disturbance. I frequently believe everything I do and say is a lie. I am often struck by the debilitating fear that my true identity will be discovered, and everyone I turn to for support will leave. Even now, I catch myself believing I am fabricating this entire story. The identity disturbance of BPD has a favorite food. It's called self-stigma, and it happens when social stigma, for example, the commonly held belief that people with BPD are abusive and manipulative, becomes internalized by the person with mental illness. For me, self-stigma looks like believing I did not deserve care because I was falsifying my suicidal crisis for attention. In this cycle, self-stigma worsens the symptoms of mental illness. I am an honors psychology student working in a clinical psychology lab and planning on pursuing a graduate degree in clinical psychology. A professor once told my class that people with mental illness should not only keep this a secret, but should never study the illness or its related characteristics. I have been told by nearly every single person to keep my disorders a secret if I aspire to pursue a career in clinical psychology. The stigma ascribed to BPD and other personality disorders stems largely from its name. What do you think about when you hear the words personality and disorder? In my introductory clinical psych course, my classmates were shocked. "You can't say a person's inherent self is disordered," they said. "This is simply a result of the pathologizing of undesirable characteristics." They were suggesting abolishing the entire construct of personality disorders. And here I was, so many of my experiences shaped by the disorder of my personality. Were they saying none of what I had experienced was real? It is harmful to assert that psychological dysfunction is due to a person's inherent self. But it is harmful as well to ignore the unique and devastating consequences of chronic, pervasive psychiatric distress. How do we reconcile the two? How do we acknowledge the difficulty of treating such distress while maintaining the essential humanity of the patient? This is where the dimensional model of personality disorders enters the scene. Historically, psychologists have placed people into personality disorder categories based on a conglomeration of clinical traits. This is a breeding ground for stigma because it suggests we were born into this category and we will remain there forever. However, what we know about the humans is that we do not fit nicely into boxes. We change over time. We interact with our environment. I was not born borderline. I was born with a set of biological vulnerabilities that interacted with my experiences to shape my phenotype, borderline personality disorder. I want to tell you another story to illustrate what I mean by dimensional. Let's imagine emotional instability, a common trait that accompanies borderline personality disorder, as a range from 0, you're totally emotionally stable, to 100, you have absolutely no control over your emotions. So all the humans will fall somewhere on this range. In childhood, I was about a 25. My emotions were intense and difficult to control. I remember in the 5th grade, I threw myself face down on the snow because I got my first C+. Because it is difficult to raise a child with these reactions, my parents would frequently tell me to control my emotions. I had never been taught emotion regulation strategies, so I didn't know how to do this. Instead, I would experience shame, anger, and guilt whenever my emotions were overwhelming. These secondary emotions moved me up the scale of emotional instability to a 50. As I grew and my emotions grew alongside me, I never learned how to effectively regulate my responses. I began to self-harm because it did just that. It was something I could do to be quiet. When I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, my placement on the scale had risen above the clinical threshold. an arbitrary number that reflects difficulty in day-to-day functioning or extreme distress. I am part of the first generation of people with BPD who will achieve full symptom remission. That is to say, the skills taught in dialectical behavior therapy will help move us back down the scale to where we began, well below the clinical threshold. As I begin to lose parts of my disorder, I wonder who I am without it. I am not neurotypical, but I no longer fit into the category of borderline personality disorder. I am living proof of the dimensional model. If people like me who experience the pathological end of the continuum were viewed through a dimensional lens, we would not be borderlines. Instead, we would be people who do not have the resources to cope with our place on the continuum. If people with personality disorders were viewed as humans first and pathological second, doctors would not refuse to treat us. If a dimensional model existed, people exhibiting traits of BPD would not be denied proper treatment due to their clinicians' fear of marking their record with this stigma. Currently, the dimensional model of personality disorders exists in the appendix of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's only there if you know where to look for it. The categorical model is still the default, and it is not until we change this that we will overcome the stigma of personality disorders. It is not until we change this that we will be able to prevent the factors that led to me walking out of that waiting room. Thank you.